Hi, everyone. Welcome to this edition of the IAMC webinar. My name is Marina Andrijevic. I'm a research scholar at the Energy, Climate, and Environment program at IATA. And I'll be presenting today something on new insights on adaptation pathways and scenarios. What I'll be covering today basically is based on the paper that we already published 2 years ago on the scenario representation of adaptive capacity for global climate change assessment. Many of you may have seen this paper. It's also been presented at an IMC conference 2 years ago. And but what I want to talk about today is the most recent follow-up to this paper, which is basically a workshop that took place just 1 month ago, where we took the foundations brought together in this paper to take them up in an interdisciplinary way with participation from broader representation from adaptation community. I'd also like to highlight, and I'm very happy about this, that this paper was recognized at the 17th IMC annual meeting last year, for which I won the Early Researcher Award. And I also wanted to use the opportunity today to thank the award committee for recognizing the importance of bringing in and integrating adaptation relevant insights in our scenario and modeling world. So without further ado, I would briefly like to cover basically the key ideas of this paper. At the risk of this being a repetition to some of you, please bear with me. And then I'm using this also as a context and then as a bridge to what we developed later in the workshop. So, as you might know, adaptation conventionally is represented in models as a certain chunk of risk that can be reduced. So the further you go along warming levels, this adaptation potential reduces because effectiveness of adaptation reduces. And a lot of stylized representations can be found both in climate impact models and in integrated assessment models that assume this adaptation to typically be unconstrained or unconditional. So if adaptation can reduce a certain portion of risk, it does it. This doesn't account for something else that we know about adaptation potential, and this is that this is a function of different socioeconomic constraints that both can be a barrier to implementing adaptation and can enable it in some cases. And this is something that we have insights into from different strands of literature that are nicely synthesized in the IPCC report. So we know that this chunk of adaptation potential is subject to these different constraints, and very importantly, that these constraints are very unequally represented around the world. So this map might be unfortunately a familiar pattern that very quickly signals that places in the world that will probably bear the brunt of climate change risk are those that have the least capacity to adapt. And on this map, you see a representation of one of the indices for adaptation readiness, the so-called NBGAIN readiness index, which showcases this variation. And if we would account for these inequalities in adaptation potential to reduce climate change impact, we might see that this risk basically goes from this potential to a reduced potential on a regional and on a global level. Why this is important for models, and sort of the bottom line of this work is that models do not incorporate the extent to which societies or systems could adapt. And this is problematic for different reasons. Most importantly, that risks of climate impact could be underestimated. So we typically would have these overly optimistic assumptions on adaptation, not accounting that this capacity is unequally distributed, and as such could be underestimating risks. And the proposal that we put forward in this paper is to integrate quantified adaptive capacity into global models. And I want to show here how we managed to connect basically what in the IPCC is found as the different dimensions that could hinder adaptation. And here you see it on the map. So adaptation is a function of economic, social, and cultural, human capacity, governance, finance, information, different types of constraints. And these constraints also can be high, medium, or low, and they're differently distributed around the world. And then it's actually very convenient for a quantitative representation that in the SSP scenarios, we basically either have as original drivers or as subsequent extensions, quantifications of all of these dimensions. So if we think about the economic and financial constraints to adaptation, or I interchangeably also call them dimensions of adaptive capacity, we have at least 6 indicators to represent different dimensions of economic and finance aspects. If we talk about governance and institutional capacity, we also there already have a variety of mostly extensions to the SSP framework that can capture this dimension. If we talk about human capacity and information, we also again have quite a few by now indicators that could capture this dimension. And even if you think about the more social and cultural dimensions within the SSP framework, we have, for example, indicators of gender inequality that are also very important for capturing adaptive capacity of a country. And I want to show examples for how we implemented this. Now, this is not from the paper that I showed in the beginning, but from another one, but just to show you how this idea of adaptive capacity could be implemented in a model is on this cooling gap example. So you might know that a way to calculate, to assess basically a gap in adaptation against heat stress is to look at the heat stress exposure. Here you have it aggregated on a country level. So heat stress minus air conditioning ownership can help you assess population that's exposed to heat stress, but that doesn't have air conditioning. And this is the adaptation gap in this area. This was, I worked on this very much on the shoulders of my colleague Alessio Mastrucci, who did a lot of groundwork on understanding the cooling gap. And basically what we did is identified the different socioeconomic variables that help us describe what drives air conditioning uptake. So from this pool of variables that we have available in the SSP framework, we tested for those that theoretically and practically made sense, and concluded that in this case, air conditioning is a function of GDP per capita, income inequality, and urbanization. And because we have those options, we have those variables projected in the SSP framework, we're also able to project future uptake of air conditioning. And from we know from a different strand of research what future heat stress exposure might be. So we're able to assess this gap and how it evolves in the future. Again, a very familiar story here that you see in terms of divergence between the different pathways in here SSP RCP, different SSPs for the same RCP to basically to show the importance of the socioeconomic dimension in producing changes in the ultimate climate risk. And a different way to show this graph basically was to express it in terms of population affected, and then you see how consequential it is, how consequential the level of adaptive capacity is for the final climate risk that a country or a region is facing. Even more recent work is developing this further. So in this case, coupling and emulating demands for air conditioning into global IAMs, and then accounting for feedbacks between heat stress energy demand and emissions. And here, this work was led by my colleague Ed Byers. Here, they've also went one step further and assessed what the implications of meeting a universal access to air conditioning would mean, both in terms of energy demands and in terms of emissions. And they've played around with different way of thinking about adaptation, which is to change. For the cooling experts among you, you'll know that it makes a lot of difference in what set point temperature you choose as to cool to. And basically, they've shown that adjusting the set point temperature can have the growth in demand. So they've shown basically different approaches to thinking about adaptation in this paper, and have made some methodological advancements too. Finally, I wanted to show work that's not published, but that we're developing then in a different sector, where we're looking at desalination capacity, both from the perspective of this meeting water scarcity, so being a powerful adaptation option to adapt to water scarcity, but at the same time being an option that has very substantial maladaptation potential. So this is already can be thought of as the next step of both understanding its potential for adaptation, but also for maladaptation, and also trying to incorporate these considerations of not only where it will be possible, but what this will mean also from the climate justice perspective. In short, some model integration is already possible. So not only is there a large portfolio of indicators that can be used for adaptation, but we've also developed some first steps showcasing how this could be done in IAMs, and we're not the only ones here at YASA. Other groups have developed approaches too. And both climate impact models and IAMs should be able to use scenario-specific and time-varying adaptive capacity to parameterize adaptation relevant inputs. And of course, for IAMs, as part of integration of climate impact into mitigation scenarios, this would be a key step towards representing adaptation. But further developments are needed. So not only since the publication of this work, and people have of course tried to do this before, but it's also emerged not only through us trying to implement these things, but also talking to the impact community, to the adaptation community. It's become clear that a closer linkage between the state of the art and adaptation and in scenarios need to be basically brought closer together. That for even better representation of adaptation, basically would need to do an even more interdisciplinary scenario building, because adaptation will be very specific across the different domains or sectors, if you will. We'll need a lot of this specific expertise, and because a lot of methodologies are being developed for basically supporting decision-making for adaptation. For example, the dynamic adaptation pathway planning that I'll mention, more connection to these specific tools and methodologies is needed. And all of this ideally to be developed in a consistent way, so that any model integration would follow a consistent protocol. And through this also information on what additional quantifications are needed within the scenario space would be needed. So motivated by this, I've teamed up with several people some of you may know. So first and foremost with Chris Ebi, who's a very well-known face to the scenario experts and the chair of the Iconics. She and I basically started championing this effort, and then together with our colleagues Matthias Garstagen from the University of Munich, Marjolein Haasnoot from Deltares and Utrecht University, and Julius Schlumberger also from Deltares and the Free University of Amsterdam, we together wrote a proposal for the workshop and eventually held it at the Lawrence Center in Leiden in the Netherlands, which gave us space for a 5-day workshop with around 40 experts from various adaptation and modeling relevant disciplines. So the first ambition of this workshop, I gave you the motivation, but then the ambition was really to then try to establish a new research community and try to learn from each other, both on the modeling side and also on the different approaches to developing adaptation pathways. And then throughout the week, try to develop some generic global adaptation pathways for some key sectors. And a big ambition was that this is useful across different scales, so both for model applications and for policy support, which sometimes have slightly different logics of implementation. And I thought it was important to spend a bit of time on what adaptation pathways are, and there are different ways to understand them. But because throughout the workshop in Leiden, we typically followed the approach developed by Marjolein Haasnoot, I wanted to show you a little bit how the dynamic adaptation pathways are organized. So they're made as support tools for decision making under uncertainties. They're made in a way where adaptation options for a given challenge, for example, are identified and their effectiveness over time is assessed, which so maybe to go back one step, you'd have an adaptation option and you would assess its effectiveness, and you'd understand when, at which point would this be insufficient, or at which point would you need to add additional adaptation actions and additional options to ensure the system is resilient. And you could do this in different ways. So different adaptation pathways would be possible, and you eventually can develop a map of different possible options and potential transfers. So if adaptation thresholds and limits are reached, to basically ensure a resilient of your system. So there's a whole science behind this. This is a very, very coarse preview, also for you to visually have in your head what an adaptation pathway map may look like. And you may have seen examples of this being applied, including in the IPCC. So in the Europe chapter, for different key risks, including here I put down an example of heat stress. Different adaptation pathways were developed, and basically we wanted to take these a step further and connect them better to the scenario space. So with this, the envisaged outcomes of the workshop were to, in the first place, come up with a proposal for adaptation-focused scenario architecture. The second and sort of the biggest practical outcome was to come up with, we call them the global scenario embedded adaptation pathways. And I'll come to what this means in a second, and also understand and come up with a proposal for what additional quantifications of adaptation relevant dimensions would need to be developed for scenarios to be more applied in adaptation. So if you have this scenario adaptation map in your head, again, we can stick with the health example. It could look something like this. So this is an illustrative example, don't overinterpret it, but basically the idea is that you have different types of options that are sequenced along different levels of warming. So the further you go, the more options you'll need, and the more tipping points for adaptation you may encounter, so points at which you need additional measures. And now the idea is that when you overlay this or embed this with scenarios, a scenario with very progressive socioeconomic development and not such high climate challenges, so an RCP1 scenario, would be quite a large option space. So a lot of these options would be available. If you're in an SP2 or RCP6 world, this option space shrinks. So you have a lot fewer options, but higher challenges because you are in a higher warming scenario. And in, for example, in SSP3, RCP3 world, this shrinks even further because the socioeconomics basically limit what you can do, limit the number of options and the extent to which these options could be implemented, while the climate challenge remains the same. So we try to basically arrive to something like this. So both develop the different adaptation pathways and connect them to the scenario space for several different thematic breakout groups. So the fact that we were there for almost a full week meant that we had the luxury of doing a lot of breakout group and a lot of hands-on engagement. And we did this basically for 4 themes that were inspired by how the global goal on adaptation is divided and formulated. So we looked at water management. In this case, the first question was, do we look at too much or too little water? And we looked at too little, so we were interested in adapting to water scarcity. We looked at food and agriculture, and specifically ensuring nutritional security. We looked at health. I'll show you what the health breakout group came up with as well, and then coastal systems or coasts. So in the course of the week, basically we first started with collaboratively defining some organizing principles to carry forward into the rest of the week. So by these organizing principles, we meant basically how to think about your overall adaptation strategy. And there would be many different ways to do this. I'm listing here some examples of outcomes that were defined in these breakout groups on day 2, basically. So it was interesting to look at whether adaptation is equitable. So do we try to ensure that adaptation actions benefit everybody, or are they more focused at, for example, if we're talking about coastal adaptation, at high asset value areas, or do we do this in a more egalitarian way? One could look at the depth of transformation as an organizing principle. So does adaptation ensure continuation of business as usual, if you will, or leads to a more transformative change? We could try to see if which part of the risk causal chain is adaptation affecting. So are you more reducing exposure, vulnerability, and several different examples that you'll see when I show basically what the sectoral groups came up with. On Wednesday, so day 3 of the workshop, in the different thematic groups, we really went then hands-on to try to identify as many as possible adaptation options, inspired by those guiding principles from day 2. So you have different adaptation options if you're trying to transform your economy versus trying to keep doing what you're already doing in a different climate. And basically, so this was the first step, to try to define all of these different adaptation options. And then in the second, to already try to sequence them in a pathway-like manner, and also try to come up with some narratives or basically descriptions that both combine what we came up with in the organizing principles and the sequencing. So try to describe this in a qualitative way. And then finally on day 4, so on Thursday, we tried to then integrate these adaptation options and sequences as pathways we then try to embed them in the SSB-RCP framework in this fashion that I tried to describe earlier with this diagram that on Wednesday we came up with an idealized basically pathway or sequence of options, and then we try to adapt the solution space based on the different SSB-RCP combinations. The idea was that we also, through this process, understand what is it that's not yet quantified in the scenarios, but we unfortunately didn't really get to listing these variables explicitly. So this is something that we still need to pick up in the papers that will follow up the workshop. So for the final part, I wanted to then show you some of the outcomes of these thematic breakout groups. And while everybody worked basically following these same steps, each theme approached this development slightly differently. And this was where also part of the richness of the workshop came from, that for us to see which considerations need to be taken into account in each different theme. And I won't be showing them, so I won't show you all the dimensions for all the themes, but basically show the distinct key elements that each theme came up with. So for example, the water scarcity group started by listing a whole long portfolio of measures against adaptation and scarcity, which they also then classified along the dimensions of whether they are more proactive or reactive as adaptation measures. And this is also can be thought of as an organizing principle. And then after listing them all, they basically went by the 3 SPs that they chose, and then assessed whether the different measures are plausible in each SSB. And here split the SSBs between high and low income countries to also assess for inequalities within different SSBs, which in this case, as you can see, is particularly relevant for SSB 3. The food and agriculture theme, for example, already also came up with a long set of options, but they also managed to sequence them in at least in an illustrative pathway. So here you also see basically where the shifts in the system happen, or where adaptation tipping points occur from the different climate shocks, and where additional measures are needed. It proved to be quite challenging, of course, for each theme, but I particularly observed this in the food and agriculture theme to come up with a global pathway. So a lot was either developed for archetypes of countries, or I think in this case, this was specifically for the Netherlands. And we had an expert in the food and agriculture theme who championed the representative agriculture pathways. So this was something that many of you are probably familiar with, and something that helped a lot to develop this connection between adaptation and scenarios further. For the health theme, it was very interesting in that they chose several specific examples and then tried to really try to develop pathways. In this case, for dengue fever, for example, again listed the different measures and tried to sequence them along the different levels of global warming, also incorporating details like the lead time needed for operationalizing a certain measure, like vaccines or building early warning systems, to where a pathway goes, to where a pathway continues, but it is perhaps less effective over time. In any case, this was proving to be quite a challenging exercise, but our health group also did an excellent job by then still merging this, matching this with the SSB-RCP combinations, and basically assessing how trends for these different measures may look like between the global north and the global south. So in which direction could they develop in the different SSB-RCP combinations? And this would be a good starting point to now try to quantify these measures further. Finally, the coast group, I here chose a very specific aspect of the work of the coastal group, because this adaptation pathways application is and scholarship basically is very developed for coastal systems, so much more so than for health or for agriculture or for water scarcity that we tested. So I took so this is to say that they already had a lot of different pathways basically available, but they focused on better understanding these organizing principles and how they may then affect both pathways and their plausibility in the different SSBs. So they focused on 3 different organizing principles. This was the worldview, depth of change, and agility, so ability of the system to change, and basically organize them along the different dimensions. And here on this figure, you could see basically the example for the worldview organizing principles. So whether you are doing adaptation in a more hierarchist, egalitarian, or individualist way, and then they classified some otherwise well-known strategies in adaptation along these different worldviews and checked how this corresponds. So basically, everything that I showed is work in progress. So I don't expect you to cite any of these, and I on purpose also left everything in basically photographs of flip sides. But this will now be taken up further to be developed in forms of manuscript. But I just wanted to showcase the diversity of approaches and outcomes and conclusions that we made in the workshop. So this brings me to the next step. As I said, we've formed throughout the workshop also author teams to now write at least 8 manuscripts, so both on these different thematic developments, but also more general overview papers. And we're currently exploring opportunities for a journal special issue. We've also tried to explore some near-term funding opportunities, so to develop these activities further, to keep this network alive and to try to diversify it further. We hope that colleagues who were maybe traditionally not joining previous scenarios forums will join us this year to present some of the outcomes and aspects more in depth. And we'll have a whole separate session basically discussing the outcomes of the workshop, then with really with where adaptation communities at home, so at Adaptation Futures in New Zealand this year. So that's to say that the workshop will kind of be discussed both at the more mainstream scenarios forum and at the more mainstream adaptation forum in New Zealand, but that we hope that there will be cross-pollination across the two, and that people will join both. I wanted to highlight still what I found as most interesting to take away for the IAM community. So basically, you probably all understand this very well, but we kept coming back to this conclusion that models of decision making, including those that we hope to advise with IAMs, with scenarios, in terms of representing adaptation, but I think it probably applied to scenarios more generally, should are needed to describe something in between the two extremes of pure ignorance or pure clairvoyance, as it was put by one of our participants. Very crucially, and we didn't even get to discussing this in the workshop at all, but that integration of adaptation and mitigation options is key. And of course, this is also an obvious one, but we need more projects, more collaboration. We need to bring these communities together to basically, when formulating either of the pathways, we assess synergies and trade-offs between the different adaptation and mitigation options to truly understand this in an integrated way. What I showed earlier was a lot of siloed sectoral adaptation pathways, but to truly make this applicable for adaptation and impacts, it should be understood in a cross-sectoral connection. So that's yet another area that we could explore. Something that I found very interesting and yet a different takeaway is that there's a major understanding from this, at least this segment of adaptation community, in understanding basically how we shift from one scenario regime to another. And this relates to the bigger logic of using scenarios as tools for robust decision making. So more than using them in an exploratory fashion, to use them to understand basically how do you move between SSB 3 to 2 and so on, and how this changes your solution space for the better or for worse. I also got a lot of energy and sort of signals that the adaptation community is very much ready to collaborate on this one. And as I said earlier, we hope for a nice presence at the Scenarios Forum and for quite some prominence of adaptation so that we could take this work up further there as well and in future projects. So I would leave it there, and thank you all for joining today. I think you're able to ask questions in the Q&A mode, and I will now stop sharing the screen to be able to see them. If there are questions that people would also like to ask, they could also just raise hands and we could unmute you. If not, that's also fine. I'm very happy if you reach out by email, both if you're interested in somehow joining in these efforts, trying to collaborate more on adaptation, or have some ideas that you'd like to share that could be useful, including with sharing with this network. Please let me know. In that case, I look forward to seeing you at the next opportunity. So perhaps at the Scenarios Forum or at the next IAMC meeting. And I'm wishing you a nice afternoon, everyone.